welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be painting one of the new Mark 6 Space Marines from the Horus Heresy. Now the model isn't out yet. I picked it up when I was at the Horus Heresy Open Day because I was invited by Games Workshop to be one of the influencers that was there, and during the day they had these little paint station things where you could have a go at painting on the models, so I just took one and took it home to paint instead. But these will be the same models that are in the game when it is eventually released. So we're going to be painting it up as a Blood Angel. The model, when I got it, was already primed. They hadn't done the best job of cleaning it up with mold lines, and they hadn't drilled the barrel, so I've had a quick go over it, but it's a bit tricky to clean them up with when they've already been sprayed. I did notice there's one more mold line I missed on one of the arms, so if you see that, I think you just see it there actually, the model's left arm, it's got a mold line right down the middle. I do clean that up later on, but you're not going to get the best finish, and also the model was completely glued together, so that was it made it a little bit more tricky, but I did actually find that having it completely glued together meant that the process was faster. So the first thing we're doing here, I'm using Mephiston Red, and I've got it on my wet palette in the top left there. Now, the important thing really for this stage is to water the paint down. So, when you take it from the pot, it's around about 50-50 water to paint. And I'm using a small Artist Opus dry brush to dab it on. You can use something like a makeup brush, or any kind of like large, round, soft brush will do the job. And it's basically just stippling it all over the armour. So when I painted this, the painting time, not including drying, took around about an hour. It's a very, very quick process. It's quite simple to do. And one of the big things that sped up the process was this stippling, just to cover all the armour and things. You might be like, oh, it looks a little bit patchy. That's part of the process, because it's going to it makes it look a bit more weathered, gives it some sort of texture as well. You can do the same thing, like if you want to do a really quick process, you can just give it a quick blast with the airbrush, and you can still get some nice highlight points and focal points and things. But it makes it look a little bit more dead. You get a very smooth finish. The idea when I'm painting this as well is I'm not going to be using an airbrush or any oils or anything like that, so it's very people just with general paints and things should be able to follow along hopefully as well. Whereas using an airbrush and oil washes and things, they do give a really good result, but it's a little bit of a higher skill level, and you need obviously a lot more money spent on equipment and materials. So the second colour here that I'm using is Evil Sunz Scarlet. Now, when I first applied the Mephiston Red, and if you notice how I'm applying it, it's dabbing the paintbrush on. It's not a case of dry brushing. You don't want to be picking up the edges. You can pick those out later, and I will be picking out a few edges as well. But you don't want that dry brushing motion. You want very gentle stippling all over. I mean, for the first layer with Mephiston Red, you can go a bit heavy-handed, because you want to get the paintbrush right in the crevices and hard to reach areas. Whereas for the Evil Sunz Scarlet, you're just picking out the areas that mainly where the light's going to fall. So this is a much more gentle approach. So really focusing on the shoulders and head and the arm holding the bulk, and those are the areas that really need the highlights, but obviously on the back of the legs as well and things. But like I said, anywhere that really catches the light. Now the final stage of this stippling is using Wild Rider Red. You have to be really careful with Wild Rider Red, because it's not really red anymore. It's sort of like a pinky orange. So this is only going on the very brightest areas. Don't worry too much if you get a little bit, if put too much on, because we're going to be putting a wash over it in a moment, but the wash will tone it right down, and we're also going to go over with some more red afterwards by hand, just to pick out some things. So it's not going to be beyond saving if you go too heavy with this. But just try not to get it, especially in the darker areas, the sort of shadow areas, because it will take away from the intensity of the red. Because the more kind of like highlight that you put on top of red, and as I mentioned, this is more like a sort of a pinky orangey kind of colour. the more of that you add, the more pinky orangey the model becomes and less red. So you really need to leave the red in the shadow areas just so that you can tell it's actually supposed to be a red model. One other thing to note while I'm thinking about it is I didn't put any decals or transfers on the model. It would be a good idea if you're going to. The reason I didn't is because I didn't have any for the Blood Angels. But if you are going to put some on, once you've finished this stippling phase, that's a good time to put the decals on. It'll add a little bit of extra time, obviously, to the process. But if you want your iconography on the model, then it's the best way to go. So here the next stage is to paint on the metallics. I'm not going to paint them black first. In a lot of cases it's a good idea to paint metallics black first. You'll get a nicer finish. However, I find that these metallics, the Vallejo metal colour airbrush colours, they cover really, really nicely. I think you can see there. And of course with the wash on top of it as well, they'll be shaded and dulled down a little bit. So it's really not that important to get the black on in this case. Maybe if you're doing like a higher display level piece or something, then you spend that bit of extra time just to get the black on there. But I found it didn't actually make a very big difference. Also, I don't show you in the video, but it is when you've done the metallics, it's also a good idea just to paint in any of the other bits that will be black. So the bolt gun itself, I've got a bit of the red on caught onto the bolt gun. Also the eyes, just paint them in black quickly. And then once got all the metallics and all the blacks, it should look something like this. So this is like a very basic looking model at this stage, but at the same time this would be perfectly fine to use on a tabletop. It's got some highlights, some shade, all the metal bits are coloured in, and it looks kind of like worn and weathered as well. This that I'm doing at the moment is just painting in the leather strap. Not all of the options in the kit come let you have a leather strap on the bolt gun. I think there's only maybe one actually that does, but it does look quite cool. It will mean that it takes a minute or two longer just to paint that extra detail. I've used Mournfang brown, just covered it like as a flat layer. So this is the wash that I'm going to be using. So it's Contrast Darkoath Flesh, and this is like to kind of make do instead of using oils. Now if you're using oils you will get like a smoother finish. However, after I looked at this, I think it didn't look too bad at all actually, and I think if you want to do a whole army like this, it should work out fine. So all I'm doing is just really slapping it on there. The nice thing as well is with using the Darkoath Flesh contrast paint is that it's way quicker. I don't have to mix up any oils or use any like mineral spirits or anything like that. So I'll just take it straight from the pot, slam it on there. You're probably going to look at it and think, well, that's this is looking a bit messy, and it is. It always looks a bit messy at this stage, regardless of the process that you're using in terms of oils or contrast paint. But the nice thing is, once it dries, all the metals will be shaded and they'll blend in a lot better. So everything looks a lot more natural, a little bit dirty and earthy. You will notice on the right hand side of the screen at the bottom there, so I've got some well palettes and I've put in some contrast medium, which is just basically contrast paint without any of the colour in it. And I've got that there. I'm using it kind of like the mineral spirit, and you can see here I'm just flooding the model on the brighter areas. So basically what this is doing is taking away some of the contrast colour from the bright parts on the model. Now one thing I did notice is, like, when you flood the model like this, you are going to get a massive build-up of paint in the recesses. This is quite a bit thicker than oil paint mixed with mineral spirits. And if I was doing this again, I'd spend a little bit more time taking off the excess paint. So all you have to do, I do it a bit in this, but all you have to do is just take a clean brush, just go over the model, kind of like brush it into the recesses and things. The paint will suck into the bristles, into the well of the paintbrush. Clean it off and just keep doing that, so that you've taken off all the excess and you're not going to leave a big puddle there. Because what will happen is, with these big puddles, when they dry, they just leave basically shiny blocks. And I did notice it was more obvious with the using the contrast paint than it would be with oils. The oils, they just go very, very thin. So it's just something to be aware of. You probably will notice a lot of them, these big pools, because they tend to pool at the underside of curves and things, all the downwards facing parts, gravity with a slightly viscous fluid. You're going to see a little kind of like a blob at the bottom. Just, pick all those off. So here, that's when it's dried and I've cleaned off a lot of the stuff. I did use a hairdryer. Sorry, no hairbrushes. I did use a hairdryer to speed up the process. I think ideally it actually dries better if you just leave it to dry normally. And then I did give it a coat of matte varnish. Now, if you do have an airbrush, the process will be quicker if you give the model a quick coat of matte varnish. But it's perfectly fine to also paint on the matte varnish by hand. Just make sure everything's dry and you won't have a problem. The matte varnish I used was Vallejo Mecha varnish. It gives a really nice kind of like flat finish. And at that stage, actually, I think I would be happy to use these on the battlefield. They look a little bit dull at this stage, but they look like they're seeing a bit of action. They're nice and grubby. You can still tell it's a nice red color. But what I'm going to be doing now is basically the fun part of the painting. So this is like where you actually get to use a brush. So on the wet palette there, you can see I've got Mephiston red, Evil Sunz Scarlet, and Wild Rider red still. You don't really need the Mephiston red, to be fair. If you just go straight in with the Evil Sunz Scarlet, which is what I'm doing, and also the marks I'm making, they are, I'm spending a little bit too much time on this. Now, the model only takes an hour, so it's not the end of the world, but you can still do it quicker. You saw I was doing a kind of like a stipply motion on the helmet and things, but what I actually find is with the paint watered down, so this is more like 60-40 water to paint, and with the matte varnish on it, it gives it a slight tiny texture. It's not something that you're going to see really by when it's in your hand, but if you got like a magnifying glass or whatever on it, and that's due to the matte varnish. So it doesn't matter what if you put a matte varnish on something, you're always going to put a tiny texture on there, because that's what helps the light diffuse when it hits it. It gives it the matte look, whereas the gloss varnish gives a very smooth finish, but also it makes it shiny, obviously. So what you're doing with the Evil Sunz Scarlet is you're just looking where the light would naturally fall. Now, hopefully, when you applied the layers of Evil Sunz Scarlet and Wild Rider Red with the large stippling brush, or the large dry brush, but as you applied it using a stippling technique, is that that already gives you a guide. And when you're applying the Evil Sunz Scarlet now, and with it watered down, you can see it just sort of very easily blends in. You might be like, why aren't you going straight for the Wild Rider Red? And this is because, as I mentioned before, Wild Rider Red is like a pinky orange. You're going to take away the red. Well, the Evil Sunz Scarlet, that's right on the edge of being a nice red, like a rich red. The Mephiston red is the nicest red, but it's a bit dark. And because they've all had that wash of the Darkoath flesh, the contrast paint, it's dulled them all down. So that's why you can go back in with the Evil Sunz Scarlet, and it gives the nice rich red. And I mean, really, I'm just faffing about here with the brush a little bit. Like, you don't have to go over these areas as much. You probably can't tell the difference with some of these marks I'm making. There's a quite an annoying hair there on his arm as well. I think that's what drew my eye to the mould line. But I do take that off. It will be gone by the end of the video. But yeah, so really this is just the time-consuming part of the painting. But again, you shouldn't be focusing like too much overall on the model. Like, you can almost ignore the legs at this stage because they're going to get some weathering powder on them, and you will just cover over it. So there's really not that much point in doing a lot of highlighting on the legs. You can see there just on the forward foot, I filled it in, and on the leg that goes underneath, just like the sort of like the edges on the toes and things like that. Obviously on the back it's the same thing. So any of the like the rear, like the upwards facing parts, so just giving a quick coat of the Evil Sunz Scarlet. It only takes a minute or two, nothing too serious. So then just the final details and things. This is now Wild Rider Red mixed with a small amount of white. Just pushes up the opacity a little bit, so you get like a harder mark when you apply it, like a more opaque mark basically. And don't go crazy doing this. Just pick out the important areas again, like head, shoulders, chest kind of area. A few details here and there. I put a nice little shine spot on his forehead. It's always interesting to put those little tiny details on like that. But don't spend too long doing it all over the model. I mean, if you want to spend longer on the model, then by all means, put these shine spots and edge details and things all over. For the edge highlights though, I would recommend only doing them on the upwards facing edges. Don't just cover all of the edges. I don't think it necessarily looks any better unless you're going for every metal style to cover all the edges. So if you just pick the upwards facing ones where the light would naturally fall, it just helps to pick out a few details and give definition to the shapes, but it saves you a lot of time, not picking out painting edges that really wouldn't catch that much light. Because for the style of this painting, the highlights, the way lighting hits the model, that's the big thing that makes it look interesting. So again, just picking out a few highlights here and there to make those areas stand out. And it is kind of important that you don't spend too long, because again, this is an army painting model. This is the part where you can very easily get a little bit carried away and just start painting too many details on. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, for my preference, I'd actually like to spend longer on this stage, but the aim was to do something quick, and that looks good. But just be aware that you can very easily start painting on lots of details here that don't add that much in terms of interest in for it being a gaming piece. Like, once you put this on the table, it's only like the bright highlights and things that are going to stand out. If you start spending ages painting in very subtle transitions, they're not going to be visible. That's something that you keep for your character models or your display pieces, or Golden Demon or whatever. You can see here, so I'm messing about on the little shine spot on the head. Again, I recommend don't do this. It doesn't make a huge difference. It does look a little bit better in photos, I suppose, and it's only the one spot. Like, the head is the most important spot on the model, so if you are going to spend a bit more time on any part of the model, make sure it's the head. Just quickly picking out the fingertips as well, just so that you can see that his hand is actually on there. That is one difference on the new Mark 6 Marines compared to the previous Horus Heresy Marine models, the plastic ones, is the hand is sculpted onto the bolter, and so the arm's separate. Now, on the previous ones, it was only the hand holding the handle that was sculpted onto the weapon. The other hand was attached to the arm, so it's a little bit different on the new ones, in that the hand is always sculpted onto the gun. So in terms of the detail on the model, it looks a little bit better because you can actually see that it's grasping the weapon properly, but it does mean that it's a little bit harder to do kind of interesting poses if you want to sculpt it. So if you want to just have him like holding the bolter in one hand and then his other hand could you could put a different weapon on it or whatever, that is a little bit more tricky to do. So in that regard, it's a bit more disappointing, but in terms of how good the pose that you can make that it comes with as standard looks, then it does look better. So it really depends on what you want to do. So now we're moving on to the eyes. These are quite quick and simple. I like to do OSL eyes just because they're quicker than doing the shiny eyes with the white dot on. You don't have to be quite as precise when you do this. So I'm starting off with Warboss Green. Just cover the eyes, very simple. The eyes on this actually are fantastic. They're nice and big and clear, so you don't have to try that hard to do this. If your hand-eye coordination isn't, if you aren't quite as steady as maybe you would prefer, painting the eyes like this is much easier than trying to paint in little white dots and highlights within the lens of the eye. So the next colour that I've gone to here is Moot Green. So for the first colour, the Warboss Green, that's around about 50-50. The Moot Green, that's watered down a little bit more. So again, it's around about 60-40 water to paint. That's just because I don't want a harsh line on it. It does mean that you have to go over the eye a little bit more to get an opaque finish, but I'm not actually that concerned about getting a perfectly opaque finish on it, because as you go over the layers, then the transitions work a little bit better because the translucency allows the previous layers to show through. The next green here is again just Moot Green with a bit of white mixed in. You can see that looks quite strong. Be careful not to paint the whole of the eye, so you can notice I've left a bit of green either side of it. As you add more white to it, it takes away from the green, so it starts to look less like a glowing green eye and more like a white eye. You can see that obviously white is the final colour that I'll be adding right in the middle of the eye. But when you do this, I mean, obviously again it depends how long you want to spend doing it, and again I'm messing around a little bit more than perhaps I need to, but again, like for an hour's painting, there's only so much time you can cut out of it. So again, spending a little bit, the majority of time on painting the head, just makes it so at least one part of the model, just elevates it that little bit higher than maybe the sort of like general models that you see. So with the white of the eye now painted in, you can go back with the Moot Green and just add a little bit of paint either side of the highlight. Now this will just punch up the colour and saturation a bit, because as I said, adding white to the highlights takes away that saturation, it looks less green. So just adding a little bit of green back in again really kind of emphasizes that it's green rather than just a white eye. For the OSL glow underneath the eye, it's really important this, when you're painting it on, always paint upwards towards the eye, don't paint down, because especially with the paint watered down, if you paint downwards, when you take the brush off the model, it will leave a slightly larger deposit of paint than where you started with the brush mark. So actually you'll get a build-up of paint going downwards. Always push the paint towards the eye, so when you lift the paintbrush off, the little deposit of paint that it leaves behind actually helps in the transition, making it lighter underneath the eye. And that's the same for every highlight pretty much. Always paint, when you're painting a highlight, towards the brightest point or highest point. And the same is true in reverse for shadows. So if you're painting a darker colour on to be a shadow, then always paint towards the darkest area. The bolt gun is very simple. It looks a little bit of a mess on the wet palette there. I kind of mixed these colours myself, just because on the rest of the wet palette I already had some black and grey paint on there. So this is a mixture of Vallejo German grey and a bit of neutral grey. The colour, whichever colour grey that you use, it doesn't matter too much. Just a dark grey. I'd probably recommend just using German grey to start with, and then having neutral grey mix in like once or twice for highlight stages. But again, don't spend too long doing this. And the highlight placement means that you're putting the paint towards the bottom end of the gun. So this isn't necessarily realistic highlights. It's more like modulation. So you have get a transition from light to dark, with light being at the bottom, and then as it gets to darker at the top, then we put a little edge highlight all the way around, which then is a high contrast highlight next to the dark, sort of the black area right next to it. And the reason for that is all because it's high contrast. It just allows all the shapes to stand out. The bolt guns for these Marines, I can't remember what this particular pattern the bolt gun is called, but it is a little bit more detailed in terms of the flat side of it is all filled in with switches and whatnot, so it makes it a little bit more irritating to paint. The old bolt guns, if you used to play second edition, the Space Marines with those bolt guns, they just basically had a flat side of them with a couple of rivets on, so those were a little bit easier. But these ones have extra details. I mean, it makes them look better, but it just slows the speeding process down a bit. So yeah, just with the greys, you can see they're painted on a couple of scratches as well. Again, just be careful not to spend too long doing this. It's very easy to just get caught up in painting all sorts of details and things extra. But again, there's nothing wrong with that if you want to. Like if you want to spend like a couple of hours on each marine, or even more, they will look better and people will be more impressed. But it depends on, especially for the Horus Heresy games, you use a lot of marines. There's a lot to get through, so how much time you want to spend on them is how long do you want to wait before you have a painted army, I guess. And so I just added a little bit of white to the neutral grey at the bottom there on the wet palette, just for a higher stage highlight. But that's pretty much it. Very straightforward. So the final thing in terms of highlighting on the marine is going back with the metallic colour. So I was using burnt iron, I think it was, by Vallejo. So when I put the matte varnish on and then the wash, that dulled it right down. So all you have to do is then go back with the same colour again, so the burnt iron colour, and just pick out the brightest parts, and it gives them their shine back because the matte varnish obviously dulls it. So it really depends what you want. In many cases, from a warfare point of view, having dulled down metal areas, or even if they're all blacked out, it would be more sensible. Whereas having like bright shiny parts of metal on your weapons and armor is just asking to be shot. But it does make it look a bit more interesting on the model to have the high contrast with the bright metallics. I say bright metallic, so it's obviously not going up to a silver color. It's just that because you're basically putting in the metallic element back to make it shiny. They obviously clearly are of a brighter element than the rest of the model. Again, don't spend too long on this. Just pick out the bits that you think will benefit from it. And I'd also recommend only picking out the raised areas on this. Normally, when I talk about highlights, I get quite specific about getting highlights into recesses depending on the direction of the lighting, because light, will flow into a recess if the recess is in line with the light source. But in this case, I just class it as grime has built up within, in the metal areas. So, leaving the recesses kind of like the dark browny colour from the Darkoath flesh colour kind of like makes sense. So for the base here, all I've done is glued sand using PVA glue. And you can see there I gave it another coat of PVA on top. That just makes it really strong and solid, so you don't rub the sand off later on. And then I gave it a coat of, I think that was Agrax Earthshade. It doesn't matter, you can use Null and Oil, Agrax Earthshade, whichever. It's just to really dull it down. And now, so this is the final stage, using some weathering powder. This is really simple, just using dark sand from Forge World. And here you can see what I was talking about in terms of not spending too long on the legs, because you're going to scrub this all over the legs. And I recommend really going to town actually on the leg area. Just really scrub it in. The one thing that I did on this, and I was a little bit annoyed at myself, was that I got a lot of dust into the kind of like the joint area underneath the feet and things, which actually doesn't make sense because it's a moving part. The dust wouldn't be in that, it'd just be in the area around it. You could just use a brush, and like a damp brush, to clean it out and things like that. But again, I was trying to rush through this to get it done quickly. So the final thing, this is purely optional if you just want a little bit of weathering. And again, this is one of those things on the model where you could very easily spend too long on it. But I think it looks cool. So it's entirely up to you again. I'd also recommend doing this before you do the base, but I just decided to add this at the end. I was looking at it and thought, you could do with a little bit extra. I'm using Rhinox hide and just doing some little dark dots on there. I do recommend that your paintbrush is reasonably sharp on the tip. Don't go using a big fat old paintbrush, because you're going to use a big blob of paint when it touches it. The main thing is put the brush into the wet paint, then rub it off on something. So usually people use their thumb. That's where you see people's hands all covered in paint, or you can rub it off on anything with a bit of a kitchen towel. But it's just so that you get the excess paint off and it leaves a sharp point on the tip of the brush, so you can do a very fine dot on there. And then the final thing, if you really want to, just to pick out some of the chips to give them a 3D effect, so go back with the Wild Rider Red, or even actually the Wild Rider Red mixed with a small amount of white. Just be careful on which part of the model the highlight is. Like if it's on one of the darker areas, and just stick to the Wild Rider Red. If it's on one of the brighter areas, then you can add a little bit of white to it. So depending on where the chip is on the model for how bright the underside is. But all it is just putting a little bit of paint on the underside of the chip, and it gives it like that three-dimensional effect, like the light's catching the lower edge. If when you do this you find that you put too much paint down, or it looks a little bit wonky, then just go back with a Rhinox hide and you can cut into it, and actually what you'll find is you'll get probably a neater, crisper line than if you had just done it like I'm doing it here. So don't worry too much if you make a slight mess trying to highlight them. And again, this is just do this quickly. Don't spend too long doing it. Hopefully the legs looking still grimy and covered in dirt, so you don't have to spend too much time on that as well. I focused mainly on the head and chest area, just because that's what people are going to look at on the model, in terms of putting details on. You can also, so like I'm doing here, just use some scratches. So this would be like very minor surface level scratches, so not going through to the primer underneath. And by that I mean with it the in-universe primer. So when the Space Marine scratch his armor, I'm assuming they use some sort of primer underneath the main color. So this is just like a very minor surface level scratch. Again, it's just detail, very quick and easy. The only thing with this is that if you make a mistake and you do a big thick line, then it's harder to fix, because there's no Rhinox hide that you can go to correct it. But of course you've got the other reds on your wet palette, so you can go over them a little bit quickly. But if again it's a quick gaming level model, so don't spend all your time just doing this. It's better to probably start on the next Marine, just to get them done, rather than fiddling around saying, oh, is that scratch too big or too small? And there you are. So obviously, as I said, the model could really do with some decal, Blood Angel symbol on the shoulder pad, and probably don't get quite as much dust in the recesses on the sort of the ankle joint area. But that's it. That's the end of the model, and that's the end of the video. So I hope you enjoyed it. I have plenty more Horus Heresy videos to come. I'm personally making a Imperial Fist army. They're going to be. I'm still testing out which colours I'm going to go for in terms of and the techniques I'm going to be using. So, but when I figured that out, then I'll be painting all sorts of things like dreadnoughts and Terminators and whatever. So you'll be able to watch that as I paint it. But also, I obviously have my Patreon and my website, which is more focused on high-level painting, painting for Golden Demon and display and things like that. But also, don't forget to subscribe. There'll be a lot more videos to come. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.